The tear was small. That was the first thing Mira told herself. Small, a finger's width at the left edge where the veil met its anchor cloth, a clean snag from the soldier's gauntlet clasp as he'd shouldered past her in the doorway. Small, manageable. She pressed 2 fingers to the fabric and held it together and told herself this as the settlement square filled with crown soldiers and the morning light did what it always did, turned the mountains behind Havenfall the colour of old copper. She had lived here for 4 years. Before Havenfall there had been the mill town of Sethwick, and before Sethwick the way station at Corra's Pass, and before that the long cold month of nothing she did not think about anymore. 7 years altogether since she had left the capital with her grandmother's veil stitched tight and her grandmother's voice in her ear. Keep it whole, above everything else. Keep it whole. The veil was not whole. 3 rows back, Taven said, appearing at her left shoulder from wherever he had been. The tannery, probably. He spent most mornings at the tannery arguing about price. He was watching the soldiers with the particular attentiveness of a man calculating how much trouble was arriving and whether it was more or less than the last time. Count at least 30, crown standard on the lead rider. I can see the banners. Just making conversation. He looked at her hand, where it pressed against the veil. He did not comment on this. The lead soldier had already dismounted and was reading from a scroll to the settlement's headman, a broad-shouldered beta named Auric, who had the expression of a man being told something he already feared. The words carried in the cold morning air: Crown territory, designation review, packless wolves required to present themselves for documentation. Required. The word had been chosen with care. It did not say demanded. It said required, which meant the law had already been written and the arguing was done. Mira counted the wolves she knew in the square. Herself, Taven, the miller's wife who had never said what she was running from, but kept silver suppressant rings on every finger, the 2 young brothers who worked the fishing boats and smelled faintly of a pack bond gone dormant. A handful of others scattered among the human settlers. The soldiers were already organizing them into a group near the east gate. She moved her fingers carefully along the torn edge. The fabric was fine woven, old. Her grandmother had made it from a blend she had never fully explained, only that the preparation required moonbloom dried in the 3rd week of the cold season, a specific clay compound from the river clay north of the capital, and 3 days of working it into the cloth in darkness. The compound was in the weave itself, not applied to the surface. When the weave tore, the compound leaked. She pressed the edges together again. If she could get to her kit, she had thread, she had a needle, she could stitch the physical tear. But the compound was already disturbed along the break. The moonbloom treatment fractured at that seam. Stitching the cloth would not restore what the chemistry had lost. Keep it whole, above everything else. Mira. Taven again, quieter. They're looking for holdouts. A soldier was moving through the square toward the far lane where she had been standing. She did not run. Running was a designation in itself. She walked to the east gate and joined the others. The soldier who processed her name asked her to state her pack history. She said packless, born independent, no prior registration. He looked at the veil and then at his ledger and wrote something she could not see. He asked if she had a craft designation. She said herbalist. He wrote that too. He moved on without asking her to remove the veil, which meant either his orders did not include it, or he was not curious enough to push. She found Taven in the group near the wagons. He looked at her hand, still pressed to the veil's left edge. He said, "How bad?" "Manageable," she said. He nodded in the way he had of accepting answers he did not believe without making a performance of disbelieving them. They had travelled together for 2 of the 4 Havenfall years, thrown into proximity by nothing except that they were both packless and both preferred the morning shift at the herbery, and had arrived at the same workbench too many mornings to keep pretending the other did not exist. He had never asked about the veil, as she had never explained it. This was the arrangement, and it had worked. The transport wagons were loaded by mid-morning. Mira climbed into the last one, her kit pressed to her chest, her hand still against the torn seam. The mountains went copper and then bronze and then grey behind them as the wagons rolled east. Havenfall disappeared behind the first ridge. Mira looked at it until she couldn't see it anymore, and then she looked at her hands. 7 years. 1 torn seam. She pressed the fabric together and held it, and did not let herself think past the next 3 hours, which was as far ahead as she could afford. She had thread but the wrong needle, a heavy leather needle from the tanning kit, too thick for the veil's fine weave. She worked with it anyway because the alternative was doing nothing, which she could not afford. The wagon swayed. The mountain road was not smooth. Around her, the other transported wolves had arranged themselves into the specific human geography of people who were frightened and trying not to show it. Backs to the walls, eyes forward, maximum space between each body. Tavin sat across from her with his arms folded and said nothing for the first hour, which she appreciated. She worked the needle through the fabric and thought about what she had. The thread was the wrong gauge. The needle the wrong type, and she had no compound preparation, only the dried herbs in her kit. Golden root, pressed willow bark, 3 bundles of common sleep moss, a sealed packet of raw clay compound she kept for general suppressant work, the kind that masked scent for professional herbalist use. None of it was moonbloom. None of it was what the veil needed. Her grandmother's voice, the compound is not the cloth. The cloth is just the carrier. What matters is the preparation, and the preparation is specific. Moonbloom dried in the 3rd week of the cold season, clay from the North River, 3 days of working it in the dark. There are other bloodlines this world has forgotten how to read. Yours is not one of them. Wolves with the nose for it will know exactly what you carry. The veil gives you the world, child. Keep it whole. Oma had died when Mira was 17, in the 2nd winter after they had gone north. She had died the way old wolves died when they had decided they were finished. Quietly, in the night, between one breath and the next, with her hands folded and her face arranged as though she had been given some time to prepare. By morning, she was simply gone. The veil was folded on the table beside her. The recipe was in Mira's head because Oma had made her recite it every day for 2 years until it was as natural as breathing. Without Moonbloom, the recipe was incomplete. She had tried substitutes: sunbell, frost lily, several varieties of northern meadowflower. None of them held the same compound structure at the molecular level that a trained healer could have explained to her in technical language. What she knew was the practical result. The substitutes degraded faster, held less completely, failed under stress in ways the original compound did not. She had found Moonbloom in most places she'd lived. It grew in river margins and rocky outcrops at altitude throughout the north. In Havenfall, she had kept a small cultivated patch behind the herbery shed. The compound she'd worked into the veil 2 months ago was still good, or had been, before the tear. Now she needed new Moonbloom, and she was in a transport wagon, going the wrong direction. "You've been mending the same spot for 2 hours," Tavin said. "I know. Is it getting better or worse?" She looked at the seam. The stitching was holding the cloth together. The compound was not restored. "It's holding," she said, which was technically true. He looked at her for a moment with those watchful dark eyes, and then looked away at the pass they were descending into. "Capital by tomorrow evening," he said. "They'll process us quickly if we're clean on the review. 3 days at most. 3 days. If the veil held for 3 days, she could find Moonbloom in the capital. It grew along the river-facing wall of the lower city. She remembered this from when she had been young and the capital had been ordinary to her. She could retreat the cloth. She could leave. The wagon hit a rut, and she grabbed the sideboard, and the torn edge pulled slightly at the stitching. She set the needle down and pressed her fingers to the seam and stayed very still. At the far end of the wagon, one of the other wolves had gone quiet in a particular way. She had not looked at him directly. A large alpha, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that took up physical space even when it was still. He had been watching the road for the first hour. Now he was watching her, not looking, watching. The specific quality of a wolf following a scent signal with its eyes while its body held artificially still. She did not look at him. She kept her fingers on the seam and her breathing even, and her face turned toward the road. He did not approach. After a while, he looked away. The capital's outer towers appeared through the evening haze as the road descended into the low country, pale stone rising above the river bend, lit by the last horizontal light. Mira looked at them for a long time without moving her hand from the veil. She had been 21 when she left. She was 28 now. The towers had not changed. The palace processing yard smelled of cold stone and authority, the particular institutional cold of a space that was cleaned thoroughly and warmed by no one. They were brought in through the servants' gate in the outer wall, 12 packless wolves in 2 lines, and stood in the grey early morning light, while officials moved among them with ledgers and the practiced efficiency of people who processed human inconveniences for a living. Mira stood near the middle of the second line and kept her hands at her sides and breathed carefully. The veil's seam had held through the night. She had slept with her fingers pressed to it, which meant she had not slept well, but the cloth was intact and the compound was still present. Degraded, but present. The designation official worked down the first line with a methodical pace. He was a beta, experienced. She could tell by the way he moved when he scent read, that particular economy of motion that came from years of practice. He read quickly and moved on, making notes. At the young beta male 3 spots ahead of her, he paused longer than the others, made 2 notes, and asked a question about prior pack registration. The beta answered. The official nodded and moved. When he reached her, he stopped. He was not rude about it. He made no comment. He simply went still in the way of a reader encountering a text that had been altered, not corrupted, not blank, but altered, and stayed still for a moment longer than the others before he looked at her face and then at the space where her face was not visible and then at his ledger. Designation, he said. Unregistered. Packless from birth. She kept her voice level. He read again. His nostrils moved slightly. She watched him process the partial signal. Something present, something obscured, the chemical equivalent of a word with 2 letters missing. He wrote in his ledger and she could not see what he wrote. Craft skill? Herbalist. He nodded and moved to the wolf beside her. From the steps at the far end of the yard, someone was watching the processing. She had not looked directly. Looking directly at anything here felt like a risk she could not calculate. But she was aware of him, a figure on the upper steps, standing with the stillness of someone who was observing rather than waiting, with the particular quality of attention that did not drift. She looked briefly. Dark overcoat, dark hair, the unmistakable posture of a man who occupied significant space in the world and had long since stopped needing to signal it. He was speaking with an advisor beside him, looking at something the advisor held, not at the yard. Then his gaze moved. Not deliberately. It was not a directed look. It was the peripheral sweep of someone whose awareness covered a room out of long habit. His eyes crossed the yard. They stopped fractionally in her direction, a pause no longer than a breath. Then he looked back at the advisor's document. He walked inside. The door closed. Mira let out a breath she had not catalogued as held. You all right? Tavin, beside her now, speaking at a volume below the processing noise. Fine. You've gone the colour of the wall. I said I'm fine. He said nothing else. The official who had processed her was at the far end of the line now, speaking to a man who had come down from the steps. Compact, hazel-eyed, with the quiet authority of someone who had been given significant responsibility and was competent enough to carry it without showing the weight. He took the official's ledger, read something, and looked across the yard toward her. She made herself stay still. He wrote something in a separate ledger of his own and tucked it under his arm and went back inside. The packless wolves were organised and walked through the inner gate. She went with the others, her kit on her shoulder, her hand not quite touching the veil's left seam. The east annex was clean and cold, a row of small rooms along a stone corridor, one room per wolf. 3 days pending designation review, a palace official told them. 3 days, and then they would each be assigned a registered status, either pack-placed, territory registered, or returned to point of origin. Mira closed the door to her room and stood with her back against it. She needed Moonbloom. The palace herbery would have it. She had seen the garden through the east gate as they came in, walled and winter sparse but real. She needed to get there before her review was moved. She needed 3 days. She pressed her fingers to the veil and looked at the ceiling and counted her remaining assets. She went before dawn. The herbery was walled on 3 sides by the palace's east wing, accessible through a narrow archway in the garden wall. The archway had no gate. She had noted this the previous evening through the annex window. She had noted the Moonbloom too, a dense patch along the north wall, winter dormant but present, the dried stalks unmistakable in their structure. She worked quickly, her hands moving through the cold with the economy of long practice. She needed the dried flower heads, which required stripping the stalks. She needed clay compound, which she had in her kit. She needed time and darkness to work it into the cloth properly. She had located all of these things. This was solvable. That patch is more productive if you take from the right side first. She did not drop the stalks. She held them and straightened and turned around. He was standing 3 rows back, close to the archway she had come through, in the dark grey wool tunic he had been wearing that morning. She recognized the collar, the loose hang of it, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who had expected to be alone and was adjusting his expectations with reasonable speed. She had not heard him come in. That was not possible, and yet here he was. The right side receives more drainage from the wall, he said. He was looking at the Moonbloom patch rather than her. The root structure is more developed, better yield. She had seen him for 4 seconds on the steps yesterday. Up close, he was less like an authority and more like a specific person, which was worse in some ways and better in others. His eyes were amber in the low pre-dawn light, and his face was not the face of a man who was performing ease. He was simply here, in the way people were simply places when they were not required to be anywhere else. "Thank you," she said, "for the information." He looked at her then, at the veil, the way everyone did, and then slightly past it in the way very few people did, as though he was noting not the concealment but the person behind it. "You're from the designation group," he said, not a question. "East Annex, yes." "Herbalist." "Yes." "The herbery is available to palace residents during daylight hours," he said, and then, in the same tone, "This is not yet daylight." She considered what she could offer here. "I have a preparation I need to make before my review," she said. "I didn't want to use the herbery time that the healers need for palace work." A pause. He looked at the Moonbloom in her hands. He was either going to ask a follow-up question or he was not. His face was very still. "I see," he said. He did not ask the follow-up question. He moved to the far end of the garden and stood looking at a dormant climbing plant on the south wall, his back to her, giving her the space to finish. She stripped the stalks she needed, wrapped them in the cloth from her kit, and straightened. "Thank you," she said again. He did not turn around. "The herbery opens at first light," he said. "You'll have better access to the preparation tools." She went back through the archway. She did not look back. She would have known if she had looked back whether he was watching her go, and she did not need to know that. She walked through the east wing corridor with her hand steady and the moon bloom wrapped in her kit and the cold pre-dawn quiet around her. In her room, she laid the cloth on the table and began to work. Stalks stripped, dried flower heads crushed between the heel of her hand and the table edge, combined with the clay compound from her kit, worked into the veil's torn seam in the dark, the way Omer had shown her. 3 passes, press and hold, wait. Her hands were steady. She was aware that this was an effort. He stood in the garden for a while after she left. She did not know this, but Voss, who had followed the king at a discreet distance out of habitual care, watched Kaelin stand in the moonbloom row with his face turned slightly in the direction she had gone, his wolf doing the thing it did when something had briefly, partially, almost landed. And then the king turned and went back inside, and Voss walked behind him and said nothing and made a note. The summons came before she expected it. She had been given 3 days and they took one. The review notice arrived with a palace runner at mid-morning, and Tavin, who had been sitting on the corridor floor outside her room, sharpening his blade, looked at the notice and looked at her and said, "Early." "Yes," she said. "That's usually not good." She knew this. She folded the notice and put it in her pocket and went. The review chamber was on the second floor of the east wing, a narrow room with a high window, a table, 2 chairs, and Voss. He was standing rather than sitting, which told her something about how he conducted reviews. He had the compact, watchful energy of a man who worked with precision rather than force and was comfortable with that arrangement. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He moved to stand before her, not behind the table, and she understood immediately that this was going to be done properly. He read scent from proximity, not distance. He circled her slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had done this enough times to know what patience produced. She breathed. She counted her heartbeats. The veil was retreated. The compound was fresh. The seam was held. He circled. He stopped in front of her and she watched him work through what he was reading. The processing visible in the slight shift of his focus, the fractional narrowing of his eyes. He had a good nose. She had met wolves with good noses before, and she knew how to read the specific quality of attention that came when one encountered something not quite resolvable. He circled again. "You use compound preparation," he said. It was not a question. "I'm an herbalist," she said. "It's standard practice to modify your own scent signature when working with plant materials. It prevents contamination of the reed." "That's accurate," Voss said. "The preparation you're using is not a standard herbalist's modification." She kept her face still. "The base notes are present but occluded," he continued. "The top notes are clean but minimal. What I'm reading is the outline of something specific, and the absence of what should fill it." He paused. "That's compound suppression of bloodline scent, not professional modification." She said nothing. He did not push. He walked to the table and made notes with the careful efficiency of a man building a case, rather than winning an argument. She watched his pen move. "I'm going to need to detain your review," he said. "There's a notation on your file I need to clarify with the senior authority before I can make a designation assignment." "How long?" "Not long." He looked up. "Are you going to run?" The question was clean and direct, and entirely without judgment. She considered it in the same spirit. "No," she said. He nodded. He wrote something else. Then he looked at the door, and she heard the footsteps in the corridor before it opened. She had been hearing them for 30 seconds, longer than she should have admitted to herself. and the quality of the room changed before the door completed its swing. He came in with the particular contained energy of a man who had been interrupted in something and was managing that fact. He looked at Voss first and then at her, and the room was small, smaller than the garden had been, and she was sitting and he was standing, and his wolf was doing something she felt in the air between them, the way you felt the pressure change before weather came through. It was not still. She would have noticed still. But it was slower. The searching quality she had been too aware of on the steps had modulated into something that was still searching, but quieter, as though the constant motion had found a direction. She put that observation away. "Your file indicates compound use," he said. "Your official and I have discussed it." He looked at the veil, the same look he'd given her in the garden, not at the concealment, but at the shape of the person behind it. "Remove the veil," he said. "No." She kept her voice level. A pause. His expression did not change. "It would clarify your designation significantly." "I understand that. My answer is still no." Another pause. Longer this time. He looked at Voss. Voss looked back with the specific neutrality of a man leaving a decision to someone with more authority. He looked at her again. "Assign her to palace service," he said finally. "Herber replacement. Her review remains open pending designation clarification." He looked at her once more, something in the amber quality of his eyes that was controlled, but not entirely settled. "You stay." It was not a question. She said, "I understand." He left. She sat for a moment after the door closed and breathed, and then she stood and smoothed her skirt and picked up her kit and walked out into the corridor, where Tavin was no longer sharpening his blade but was simply sitting with his wrists on his knees, waiting. He took one look at her. "How bad?" he said. "Complicated," she said. He stood up. "Right," he said. "I'll sharpen the blade later then." The palace herbery was better than she had let herself anticipate. The senior healer was a sharp-eyed woman of 60 named Caris, who had been working the palace preparations for 30 years and had the absolute authority of someone who considered competence the only currency that mattered. She had looked at Mira on the first morning, asked her to identify 7 unlabeled dried specimens on the preparation table, watched her do it without error and said, "Compound bench is yours. 3rd station from the left." That had been 4 days ago. She worked and the work was good. She knew things about extraction and drying technique and compound stability that Caris found useful, and Caris was not the kind of woman who pretended otherwise. The healer's table began to have better margins on its preparations. A pain compound that had been running thin stretched further with a modification Mira suggested. Caris watched her make it and said nothing except that she would need the ratio written down before end of week. This was, Mira thought, the best version of a bad situation. He came on the 2nd day. She heard the archway ahead of his appearance, the change in ambient sound that happened when someone of particular presence was about to enter a space, the way junior staff moved with slightly more precision. She was at the compound bench with her back to the archway, and she continued what she was doing. "Caris," he said, "the preparation for Lord Veron's joint complaint." "Ready Thursday," Caris said without looking up. A pause. She could feel him in the room the way she felt weather, not dramatically, not as compulsion, just as presence. His wolf was doing the slower searching thing again. She had begun to track it without intending to, the way you tracked a sound that repeated at irregular intervals until you were doing it without thought. She kept her eyes on the compound bench. He left after 2 minutes. She let out one careful breath. He came on the 4th day too, with Voss. Something about a preparation the stables needed. He stood in the archway for longer than the errand required. She was repotting a dormant herb at the far bench. She did not look up. When she heard him leave, she realized she had been pressing the soil into the pot with more force than necessary. And then there was the afternoon he arrived, and Nessa was already there. She had come with a question about a rose preparation for the court seamstress. Legitimate, brief. She stood in the archway with the afternoon light behind her, honey gold and elegant, and she had the particular ease of a woman who had grown up knowing this palace was hers to move through. She smiled when she saw him crossing the garden. He stopped. They spoke for a moment, something social, something light, and Nessa's laugh was genuine and pleasant, and Mira was inside at the compound bench with soil on her hands and the veil slightly warm from the afternoon. She looked down at her hands and kept working. That evening he did not come to the herbery. She noted this while she was cleaning the compound bench. She put the cloth down. She picked it back up. She was noting the absence of a king's presence in a garden she had no claim to, and she was doing it with the specific thoroughness of a person who was tracking something she had already decided not to track. She corrected herself flatly and finished cleaning the bench. Taven was in the annex corridor when she came back, sitting on a windowsill and looking at the courtyard below with the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he was not pleased about. "How long?" he said without looking at her. She knew what he was asking. "Long enough," she said. "The compound is holding well." He looked at her then. "I meant how long before you let yourself be somewhere," he said. "Not how long before the veil fails." She did not answer this because there was no answer she could give him that was honest and also comfortable, and she was too tired for dishonest comfort. She said, "Good night, Taven." He said, "Yeah," and looked back out the window. Aldrich arrived on a Thursday. She heard his name from the kitchen passage where she was delivering a preparation to the healer's stores, spoken by two palace servants to each other in the tone of people who had been waiting for something to happen and were now tracking whether it would be worse or less bad than anticipated. Lord Aldrich, Eastern Alliance, the king's long-standing political partner, expected for the winter session. She set the preparation down on the store's shelf and stood for a moment in the cold passage. She had been 21. She had been in her father's house, which was no longer hers by then. Her parents gone, the estate in review, the border territories her family had held for 3 generations sitting in a political gap that various interests were maneuvering to fill. She had been packless and young and in possession of an old bloodline whose significance she had not fully understood, wearing a veil that made the court think she was strange, and Aldrich had arrived with a proposal. He had been very reasonable. He had not threatened her. He had explained, with the courtesy of a man who considered himself civilized, that her continued presence in the capital was creating a complication for a territorial arrangement that would benefit significantly from her absence. He had said this the way someone might say that a piece of furniture was blocking the natural flow of a room. He had offered her resources for relocation and suggested she take them. She had been 21 and alone, and she had taken them. The territories folded into Aldrich's holdings within the season. She had watched it from Sethwick with the particular cold clarity of someone who had understood, in retrospect, exactly how the calculation had worked. Now he was here. She picked up the preparation and finished delivering it, and went back to the herbery and worked with careful concentration for the rest of the morning and did not think about Aldrich. Taven found her at the compound bench after midday. He had a way of finding her when she needed not to be found alone that she had never requested and had come to rely on without acknowledging. "Heard there's a new political arrival," he said, picking up a dried specimen from the table and turning it in his fingers. "Put that down." He put it down. "Anyone you know?" She was quiet for a moment. "Possibly," she said, distantly. He looked at her with those dark, watchful eyes. "Is that why your hands are doing that?" She looked at her hands. She had been pressing the compound into the preparation cloth with the same excessive force she had used on the soil 4 days ago. She made herself stop. She did not tell Taven about Aldrich. There was not enough in the telling that would help either of them, and the shape of what had happened 7 years ago would require explaining the bloodline and the veil, and she had not done that yet. She was not certain she could. That evening, Voss came to the herbery at closing. She was rinsing tools at the water bench when he appeared in the archway. He looked at her with the expression she had come to read as meaning he was about to tell her something she would not enjoy. "There is a formal dinner tonight," he said. "Palace guests and staff are required to present in the main hall at 7th bell." "I understand," he paused. "Lord Aldrich asked after you this afternoon." She kept rinsing the tool in her hand. The water was cold against her fingers. "What did he ask?" "He asked who the veiled herbalist was, where she'd come from." Voss's tone was careful and neutral, and communicating a great deal through that care. "I thought you should know." "Thank you," she said. He left. She stood at the water bench for a long time after his footsteps faded. The tool in her hand was clean, had been clean for some time. She put it down. She went to the formal dinner. She stood with the palace staff along the east wall and watched the court fill with nobility in their winter clothes, and she did not look at Aldrich directly. She felt him, the way you felt a thing you were specifically trying not to look at, in her peripheral awareness the whole evening. Silver-threaded hair, the dark green overcoat, the walking staff. He moved through the room with the ease of a man on familiar terrain. He did not look at her, or rather, he looked at her exactly once, a sweep of the eye that caught and released her in less than a second, and then he moved on, and she could not read from that fraction what he had decided. Later, in his study on the palace's upper floor, Calen sat with documents he was not reading, and his wolf doing the thing it had been doing since the night in the herbery, slower than it had been, less frantic, but still present, still moving, like something that had been handed a direction but not yet arrived at a destination. He had run his kingdom for 9 years. He had administered territory, managed alliances, survived 3 attempts on his authority, and 1 on his life. His wolf had spent those 9 years searching with the relentless, grinding persistence of something that could not stop, because stopping would mean accepting that what it was looking for did not exist. He put his pen down. He looked at the window. He thought about moonbloom, dried in the dark, and hands that moved with the certain economy of someone who had been working with herbs for years, and the way his wolf had felt in that garden. Not still. He was not going to claim still. He was not going to build a case on nothing, but quieter, measurably, specifically quieter, in a way that had continued across every hour she had been in the palace, a background hum beneath the constant search. He picked the pen back up, he put it down again. In the east annex, Mira lay on her back in the narrow bed, with her hand pressed to the veil's seam, whole, treated, intact, and looked at the ceiling and thought about Aldrich's 1-second look across the main hall, and about the fact that she had run out of unremarkable ways to be here. He came to the herbery the next morning, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he came alone, without Voss, and waited until Caris had taken her preparation list to the storeroom before he spoke. "Aldrich spoke to you yesterday." She was measuring compound into a clay bowl. She did not stop. "He asked who I was. Voss told me." "That's not what I mean." He came further into the herbery, stopping on the far side of the work table. "He approached you directly, in the east garden passage after the dinner." She looked up at that. She had not seen anyone in the passage. "There are people whose function is to know what happens in this palace," he said. "Aldrich asked you to leave." She set the measuring tool down. "Yes." "And you said." "That I would think about it." She looked at him directly. "I was being careful. I didn't want him to know how much the suggestion mattered." He was looking at her with that contained, precise attention. "Why does it matter? What is your connection to Aldrich?" She thought about what she could give him. She thought about the border territories folded into Aldrich's holdings, about being 21 and packless, and the specific mechanics of how a powerful man removed a minor obstacle from his path by being very reasonable about it. "He moved me once before," she said. 7 years ago. I was in the capital, and he had a use for the territories my family held, and I was in the way. He suggested I leave. I did." She paused. "He would like me to do it again." "Why?" She looked at the compound bowl. "I don't know," she said, which was partially true. She did not know the full shape of what she was to him now, whether it was the same calculation as before or something new. What she knew was that his inquiry had come faster this time. He had identified her within a day of arrival. The veil was more degraded than it had ever been. She was leaking more than she had 7 years ago. She did not say this. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel his wolf in the room, the slower searching quality, present the way it always was now, the background current that ran beneath every interaction they'd had in this palace. "Are you going to leave?" he said. "I don't know that either." She looked up at him. "I have fewer moves than I did 7 years ago. Running confirms his interest. Staying keeps me in his line." "You're in my palace," he said. The words were flat and direct. Not possessive, practical. "Whatever Aldrich's interest is, it has limited reach here." "Limited," she said. "Not none." "No," he agreed. "Not none." A silence. He did not offer her more than the honest partial reassurance, which she found she respected. She picked up the measuring tool again. "Thank you," she said. He went to the archway. Stopped. "Voss was 20 feet behind you in the passage," he said. "He was there because I asked him to be. Aldrich knows this." He left. She stood with the measuring tool in her hand and thought about that. He had known Aldrich would move on her before it happened. He had placed someone there. He had not told her in advance, and he was telling her now, and the information was both protection and its own kind of pressure, the weight of someone's attention held in the space where she had been standing. She put the tool down and picked it back up and measured the compound and thought about nothing useful for several minutes. At midday, Voss came to the herbery with the expression she had learned to read as news. "The king would like to speak with you," he said. "This evening." "I expected that," she said. He looked at her with something that might have been, on another face, sympathy. "I know you did," he said. His study was on the upper floor, accessed through a corridor that smelled of old stone and beeswax candles and faintly pine. The same scent she had registered in the garden. She had registered it again in the herbery. She had stopped pretending this was coincidental. He was standing by the window when she came in. Voss closed the door behind her from the outside. "Sit," he said. "I'd rather stand." He turned from the window. He looked at her for a moment and then did not push it, which she noted. "Tell me what you told Aldrich," he said. "That I would think about leaving." "And have you thought about it?" "Yes." "And—" She looked at the window past his shoulder, at the night and the distant lights of the lower city. "I am not going to leave," she said. "I made that decision this afternoon." She paused. "I don't know what it costs yet. I'm making it anyway." He was quiet. She could see the amber quality of his eyes in the candlelight, settled, present, that specific undercurrent of his wolf that she had been tracking for days now, without wanting to name what she was tracking. "Remove the veil," he said. "No." "I'm asking," he said. "Not ordering." "I know you are." She kept her voice even. "The answer is still no." A long silence. He turned back to the window. Outside, the lower city lights moved in the cold wind, torchlit, river adjacent, the same lights she had looked at from the transport wagon 3 weeks ago and felt nothing except the flat recognition of a place she had left. "Your veil is a suppressant compound," he said, not a question. She said nothing. I am not going to ask you what it suppresses. His voice was careful. I am going to tell you something instead. He paused, and she heard him choose the words with the deliberateness of someone who had been building toward them for a while and was now setting them down. My wolf has been searching for 7 years, since I took the throne. It searches constantly. It has never settled. It does not rest. He looked at the window. In 3 weeks you have been in this palace. It has been quieter than it has been in 7 years. The candlelight moved. She was very still. I am not making a claim, he said. I am not asking you to name what this is. I am asking you not to disappear. She looked at him. At the back of his head, the dark hair, the set of his shoulders that were carrying something she was beginning to understand, was not political burden, but this. The specific weight of a wolf that had been running for years without knowing what it was running toward. I can't promise you that, she said. I know. He turned. His eyes were amber lit at the edges, the wolf close to the surface, controlled but visible. I know. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 7 years of moonbloom and river clay and darkness, about Omer's hands on the cloth, about the alpha in the transport wagon going still, about the designation official's fractional pause, about the slow peripheral awareness of his wolf in every room she had shared with him as it searched and didn't quite find. She said, "The veil is warm." He went still. "When I'm close to you," she said, "the compound reacts. It's a thermal response, emotional stress, proximity to a strong signal. The compound I use generates heat when it's under pressure." She looked at her hands. "It has been warm every time you've been in the herbery." The silence was enormous. "I'm not telling you what that means," she said. "I'm telling you what it does." He said nothing. She looked up, and his expression was the most uncontrolled thing she had seen on his face. Not broken open, nothing dramatic, but the control had a fracture in it, a single line of something that was not political, not administrative, not the authority he wore the way other men wore their coats. She went to the door. "Mira," he said. She stopped. "The herbery opens at first light," he said, and then, quieter, "I'll be there at first light." She put her hand on the door frame and stood there for a moment and felt the veil warm against her jaw. Then she walked out into the corridor and put her hand against the stone wall and breathed until her hands were steady. Aldrich moved on a Tuesday in the main hall at the morning assembly. She heard her name and turned and understood within 2 sentences what was happening. A palace official she did not recognize was reading from a document. Compound suppression of designation status, evasion of formal registration protocols, a list of provisions from pack law that were entirely accurately cited. She had known these provisions existed. She had lived inside their reach for 7 years and navigated around them carefully enough that they had never caught her. She had not been careful enough. She was brought forward by a guard, not roughly, just firmly, the procedural inevitability of it. The hall was full. Court wolves, council members, visiting dignitaries, palace staff along the walls. Tavin, somewhere at the back, she could feel the specific quality of his stillness. Nessa beside her father, her expression uncertain. Aldrich himself, standing with the composed ease of a man reading the final paragraph of a letter he had already written. She looked at the dais. Kaelin was there. He looked at her, at the veil, at her hands at her sides, at the guard beside her, and something in his face settled into a specific quality of control that was different from his ordinary control. Colder, more contained. She had not seen this before. Aldrich was speaking now. His voice was warm and regretful, a masterwork of reasonable concern. The law was clear. The protocols existed to protect the integrity of the designation system. He had no pleasure in raising this. The matter was simply one of procedure. She heard the official behind her and felt the hand come from behind, and the veil was gone. The compound failed. It did not fail gradually. The seam she had restitched, the compound she had retreated, the careful maintenance of 7 years, all of it released at once, the chemistry destabilized by the physical removal, and the bloodline scent came out of her like a door opening onto a room that had been sealed for a decade. The whole changed. It was not dramatic. It was biological. Wolves went still. That specific quality of cessation that happened when a scent signal was strong enough to override the cognitive layer and speak directly to the animal. Several of them looked at each other. One council member, an old wolf with a white-streaked beard, put his hand over his mouth. The senior healer, standing with the palace staff, closed her eyes, and Kaylin's wolf stopped searching. She felt it. She could not have explained how she felt it. Through the air, through the compound's absence, through the specific quality of the silence that came from the dais. But she felt the moment his wolf found what it had been running toward for 7 years and simply, completely stopped. His eyes flooded amber, not lit at the edges. Flooded, the warm gold detonating through the grey, the wolf entirely present and not performing control anymore. He was off the dais before she had finished processing what she was seeing. 3 steps and he was standing in front of her, between her and the hall, his back to the crowd, facing her. She was looking at him. Her face was uncovered, her hair loose around her shoulders, 7 years of concealment gone in a single second, and she was looking at a man whose wolf had just found her and who was standing with his body as a wall between her and the room. He did not touch her. He did not speak yet. He looked at her face, actually looked, the way he had been unable to in the herbery and the garden and the study. And whatever he saw, there was not what the hall had expected from a veiled woman, which was something terrible. It was simply a face. Her face. The face of a woman who had been hiding for a very long time and was now completely and irrevocably visible. The hall was absolutely silent. Kaylin turned to face the room. His eyes were still amber-lit. His voice, when he spoke, carried the full biological weight of an alpha king's authority. Not alpha voice, not compulsion, just the specific gravity of absolute power used without decoration. "Lord Aldrich," he said, "will step back from these proceedings." Aldrich did not step back. He was too experienced for that. He spread his hands with the gesture of a man who had no personal stake and said, with perfect reasonableness, that the law did not distinguish between the motivations of the person raising a procedural matter, only whether the matter was procedurally accurate. It was. He was certain the king understood. Kaylin looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the council member with the white-streaked beard, who had lowered his hand from his mouth and was sitting with a specific quality of ancient recognition on his face. "Council Elder Havan," Kaylin said. "What designation does she carry?" Havan rose slowly. He was very old, the kind of old that came with genuine authority rather than accumulated tenure. He looked at Mira, not the way the hall was looking at her, with shock or calculation, but with the specific gravity of someone reading a text they had studied but never expected to see in the flesh. "Healer bloodline," Havan said. His voice was steady and very quiet, and the hall strained to hear it. "Ancient line, pre-pack formation era." He paused. "The primary records describe the scent signature. I have read those records for 40 years. He looked at her for one more moment. "We believed this line was gone." The hall exhaled. Aldrich's composure held. He said, still measured, that this was fascinating but did not address the registration violation which remained. "The healer bloodline predates the registration system," Kaylin said. He looked at Aldrich with the expression she had seen once before, when Aldrich had been reasonable in the study, and Kaylin had named it for what it was. "It predates pack formation itself. There is no applicable registration protocol because the protocol was written for designations that came after. You know this." Aldrich said nothing. "You also know," Kaelin continued in the same even tone, "that pack law does not permit interference with a fated bond recognition." He turned to Voss. The Hall understood what was coming before he said it. She could feel it in the change of quality in the room. That specific held breath of people who had just processed a king's intention a second before he voiced it. "Bring me the bond testing stone," Kaelin said. The sound that moved through the hall was not dramatic. It was low and organic, the sound of 100 wolves processing a piece of information simultaneously. Beside her father, Nessa had gone pale. Aldrich did not move, but something in his stillness changed. The composed ease had a fracture in it now, fine and visible. "Your Majesty," Aldrich's voice was still controlled, "I must remind the king that there is an existing political arrangement." "Cite the statute," Kaelin said. A pause. "Pack Law, Section 12, Kaelin said. "A confirmed fated bond supersedes any prior political arrangement without exception and without appeal. You helped write that revision, Aldrich. I remember the session." He looked at him with amber eyes that were completely steady. "Cite the statute that overrides it." The silence stretched. Aldrich said nothing. Mira, standing in the centre of the hall, with her hair loose and her face uncovered for the first time in 7 years, looked at the back of Kaelin's coat and thought about what it meant that he was not looking at her right now. That he was facing the hall, facing Aldrich, standing between her and the proceeding with his authority arranged in front of her like a wall. 7 years ago there had been no wall. There had been a very reasonable man, and an empty room, and a young woman with no moves. She put her hand against the absent weight of the veil. At the back of the hall, Tavin had uncrossed his arms. He was watching with the expression of someone recalibrating their assessment of a situation they thought they had understood. The bond testing stone arrived in Voss's hands, carried in a plain wooden box, old and worn at the corners. He set it on the floor of the hall between Mira and where Kaelin now turned to stand. The stone was pale grey, the size of a man's fist, unremarkable in every visible quality. She had seen bond testing stones described in the old texts her grandmother had kept. She had not expected to stand on one side of one with the hall watching. Kaelin was on the other side. He looked at her. The hall was very quiet. She stepped forward to the stone. He did the same. She looked at him, at his face, at the amber still quality of his eyes, at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and the specific way he was looking at her, which was the way he had been looking at her since the herbery, except without any of the careful management of it. All of it present and none of it controlled. She said quietly, only for him, "I ran from you for 7 years." He said, "I know." "I didn't know it was you." "I know that too." "If I had known," she said, and stopped. "You would have run harder," he said. "Not unkind, accurate." She almost smiled. "Probably." He said, "I would have too." She put her hand on the stone. He put his hand on the stone. Their fingers were 2 inches apart on the grey surface, and the hall was absolutely silent, and the bond that had been building for 7 years under compound and distance, and a torn seam and 3 weeks of proximity, and a wolf that would not stop searching, that bond responded. The stone did not glow, it did not hum, it shattered. A clean fracture through the centre, thus 2 pieces, the break so precise and complete it looked like intention. The sound was small in the large hall, a single sharp crack, and then silence. The hall did not erupt. It went the opposite. More still, a deeper quiet. The kind that happened when something ancient was recognized. Elder Hovan sat down slowly, both hands on the table, his face arranged in the expression of a man who had read about this moment and was now sitting inside it. Voss moved. She had not seen him leave the floor, but he was already at Aldrich's position, and 2 guards were behind him, and he had a document in his hand. He read from it in the clipped, efficient voice of a man who had been building this case for 3 weeks and was now delivering it. Communications between Aldrich and a compound supplier. Specifications for a bond suppression preparation designed not to mask the subject's scent, but to dull the receiver's ability to register fated bond signals. Kaelin had not been searching blind for 7 years because Mira was hidden. He had been searching blind because Aldrich had been suppressing his bond-sensing capacity directly, routing the compound through the formal political dinners, the correspondence seal wax, the very documents Kaelin reviewed as standard governance. 7 years of deliberate chemical interference with the Alpha King's wolf. The documents were read aloud. The hall listened. Beside Aldrich, Nessa made a sound. Not a performance. Something real. A short, broken noise that she immediately controlled. She had not known. That was visible on her face in the specific way that truth was always visible when it arrived without preparation. She had believed herself to be forming a natural bond. She had been administered a compound that produced the chemistry of closeness without the biology beneath it. She had believed what she felt was real because from inside it had been real to her. She put one hand over her mouth and looked at nothing. Aldrich said, "This is a fabrication." Voss said, "The compound supplier has already given a statement." Aldrich said nothing more. The guards moved. He went with them the way experienced men who had lost went with guards. Without struggle, with the terrible composure of someone who was already calculating the next position. He did not look at Nessa. She did not look at him. The hall was very quiet. Mira was standing in the center of it with the pieces of the stone at her feet and 7 years of it landing all at once, not dramatically, not in a flood, just in the specific heavy way that things landed when you had been carrying them for a very long time, and the thing you had been carrying was suddenly, irrevocably, gone. She looked at the floor, at the 2 pieces of grey stone, at her hands which were not shaking. She looked up. He did not make a speech. He walked back to where she was standing in the center of the hall, and he stood before her, and he said, simply and clearly, with the hall watching and Elderhaven seated at the council table, and Voss at the perimeter, and Tavin in the back, with his arms folded and his jaw working. "Will you let me claim you?" Not an order. His voice was entirely without compulsion, just the question, direct and without ornament. The voice of a man and not a king. She looked at him. She thought about Omer, candlelight on the preparation cloth, the smell of moonbloom and clay and darkness, and Omer's voice. You carry something rare and it will attract what you are not ready for. You will know when you are ready. She thought about 7 years. Sethwick and Corra's Pass, and Havenfall, and the Transport Wagon, and the Torn Seam, and the Herbery at dawn, and his wolf going slower in every room she had been in with him, slower and slower until it stopped. She thought about the Herbery bench at first light when he had come, as he had said he would, and stood in the archway without purpose and without performance, and she had not sent him away. "Yes," she said. It was a small word for the size of what it contained. He claimed her formally in the hall, the verbal claim first in the old language, witnessed and permanent, his voice carrying the words with the weight they had carried for 1,000 years of pack law, mine, claimed, bound. Then he looked at her, one question in his eyes, and she tilted her head to the side and gave him her throat. His hands were careful. His mouth at her neck was warm, and she felt his wolf, not through compulsion, but through the specific biological reality of proximity, the final pressure of a 7-year search about to resolve. She closed her eyes. Her hands were in his hair. The claiming bite landed and the bond came in like a door thrown open. Not gradual, not assembled piece by piece. All at once, the full weight of what had been building under compound and distance and years. His wolf, warm and absolutely still at last, a stillness so complete she felt it the way she felt her own heartbeat. His grief for the time lost, the specific quality of a wolf that had searched and finally, irrevocably, did not need to search anymore. Warmth along every nerve. The mark at her throat burned bright and clean. She pressed her forehead against his jaw and breathed and felt him breathe. The hall was still. Then Elder Haven rose. He rose slowly, with the deliberateness of age, and he did not say anything. He simply stood. Beside him, a council member rose. Then another. One of the visiting nobles at the far end of the hall stood, and then the wolves along the walls, and then it was simply happening. The room standing, not because anyone called for it, but because a fated bond completing after 7 years of interference was the kind of thing the verse recognized and answered. She felt Kaelin look at the room. She felt his wolf feel the room. The stillness in him was enormous and new, and she understood that it was not composure. It was the specific quality of a thing that had been searching for so long that rest itself felt foreign. She understood this because she felt it too. At the back of the hall, Taven did not applaud. He stood with his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly, and blinked 3 times in quick succession at the far wall, and then looked at the ceiling, and then looked back at her with an expression that could not be called emotional by any generous definition of the term. She looked at him across the length of the hall. He gave her one short, definitive nod. She looked back at Kaelin, and he was watching her face with the same quality of attention he had been using since the herbery, since the garden, since the very first dawn in the Moonbloom Row, watching her the way his wolf had been oriented toward her even when his human mind was performing indifference. All of it now visible, none of it managed. She held up her hand. In it, the torn remnant of the veil. She had picked it up from the floor without thinking. The reflex of 7 years, the hand that reached for it before the mind did. She looked at it, the fine dark weave, threadbare at the seam where she had stitched and restitched it. The thing that had protected her, and the thing that could not finally hold. The thing that had been enough, and then not enough, and then unnecessary, and she had not understood until this moment that it had always been leading here. That Omer had known it was a temporary measure, that temporary was not forever, that some things were carried for the time you needed them and set down when you arrived. She set it down. On the floor beside the 2 pieces of grey stone, the small dark cloth lay and meant nothing anymore. Kaelin looked at it. He looked at her. She saw in his face the recognition of what it was. Not the veil he had always seen, but the thing behind it. The 7 years it contained. The compound and the exile and the running and the ending of the running. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His wolf was still. 6 months later, the herbery in the hour before first light. Mira's hands in the soil, working a preparation that was hers now in a way nothing had been hers for 7 years. The palace was quiet around the garden walls. Cold still, the last edge of winter in the air, but the moonbloom was coming up along the north wall, green at the tips, the first spring growth. She heard his step in the archway. She did not look up. He came to the bench and set 2 cups of tea on the edge of the wood and sat beside the growing things. He did not speak. He watched her work with the particular quality of stillness that was, she had learned, simply how his wolf rested now, present and quiet and entirely without the searching. 7 years of it, and this was what came after. A man on a bench in a cold garden before dawn, a cup of tea, his mate's hands in the soil. She reached over without looking and took one of the cups. The bond ran between them, warm and settled, the way it had been running since the hall. She had thought she would need time to accustom herself to it. She had not needed time. It had felt, from the first moment, exactly like coming into a room where the fire was already lit. The moonbloom reached toward the pale sky. She kept working,